5 years ago this month, Ontarians came to discover how deficient the province's investigations into some criminally suspicious child deaths truly were. Mr. Justice Stephen Goudge released a report showing a shocking number of adults were wrongly convicted of crimes as a result of the testimony of former pathologist Charles Smith. The Goudge inquiry pointed to appalling ethical breaches by Smith, as well as systemic problems inside Ontario's forensic pathology system. 5 years after Goudge, are things any better? Let's ask Michael Pollanen, who for 5 years has been the province's chief forensic pathologist and the man tasked with fixing this mess. And we welcome you here to TVO.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, let us understand what you inherited. Would it be accurate to characterize the mess that you inherited as the most egregious systemic miscarriage of criminal justice in Canadian history?
It would be accurate to say that in Ontario we had a number of wrongful convictions that stem from deficient medical evidence, and that did represent a major systemic problem that needed to be fixed.
I'm going a little further than that, though. I'm calling this, and you tell me if I'm overdoing it here, but a systemic miscarriage of criminal justice.
I think that is correct. I would say that what we learned from the Goudge inquiry was that there were a number of failures across all parts of the criminal justice and death investigation system that needed to be strengthened and modernized to improve criminal justice. Basically, what we found out through the inquiry was that the people of Ontario deserve better in terms of its forensic pathology system.
Before we figure out what you did to try to make things better, let's remind everybody of the kinds of things, because we're going back several years now. Charles Smith got on the stand. He was a man who had, we thought, a lot of integrity and a lot of authority to bring his conclusions to bear, and he simply lied and got people convicted. Give us an example.
Well, I think the issue with Dr. Smith and some of the issues that were pervasive at the time in forensic pathology was a misunderstanding of some of the fundamental roles of a forensic pathologist. For example, at the time, one of the mottos was to think dirty. In other words, that there was an a priori stance that forensic pathologists should take when approaching a case. Whereas now, the pervasive view among forensic pathologists is to think truth. So in other words, instead of approaching a case with a specific view about whether or not a criminal act occurred, we now objectively look at the evidence and try and see where the evidence takes us to a logical conclusion.
Essentially go in with an open mind.
Go in with an open mind and go in with the view that credibility is the main issue, and that as a credible expert witness, you must be impartial, and really start off with the position of offering the courts and the public what science and medicine can offer in a particular death.
Well, let's do one example, the Mullins-Johnson case. Remind us what happened.
So the Mullins-Johnson case is probably the index case for the Goudge inquiry. And what happened in that case was a man was wrongly convicted of the rape and murder of his 4-year-old niece. And this was largely based upon misinterpretation of autopsy findings. And one of the things that happened in that case, and indeed in many such cases, is that normal changes that the body undergoes after death can be misinterpreted as injuries. If that happens under certain investigative circumstances, the courts may be unable to separate the misinterpretation from truth and go down the path of conviction.
But what happened to Mr. Mullins-Johnson as a result of bad testimony brought forward by Dr. Smith?
So what happened ultimately was he was convicted of first-degree murder, and then through the provisions in the criminal justice system, the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, led by James Lockyer, then brought the case back into a post-conviction review process.
How long was he in jail?
Over 10 years.
10 years in jail for about the most heinous crime you can be accused of committing, and he didn't do it.
Well, the Court of Appeal found that the conviction should be quashed based upon the fresh evidence.
So all of this starts to come to the public's attention, and the provincial government in its wisdom decides that it's going to get to the bottom of it through a public inquiry. They appoint Stephen Goudge, the Supreme Court judge. He holds hearings, makes recommendations. How important do you think those recommendations were to getting things back on track?
Critically important. one of the things that I can say, you know, not as a forensic pathologist, but just as a Canadian, is that the public inquiry system that we have is very robust and is a great mechanism to implement systemic change. And that's exactly what happened with the Goudge inquiry. So the Goudge inquiry actually produced a series of recommendations that formed a blueprint of the way forward, the path forward. And then me, my team, and the broader criminal justice system could respond to those recommendations and really recreate, strengthen, professionalize, modernize the forensic pathology service.
Let's go through some of it and figure out what's different now from the way it used to be. Starting with, I guess if you go to Downsview, which is a neighborhood in northern part of Toronto, you'll find a $500 million new headquarters for you guys. What
Yes.
goes on there?
Well, what goes on there is the application of cutting-edge technology to the investigation of deaths of public interest. This spans the entire process of death investigation, right from the examination of bodies in the autopsy room, post-mortem imaging with CAT scanners and other imaging devices that you would find in modern hospitals, straight through to sequencing candidate genes that might be relevant in sudden death, and then also facilitating the work of the coroner system through providing inquest courts. It really is a modern death investigation facility from beginning to end, where the public is served by forensic pathologists and all the other experts that make up this team.
And lets you do now what that you couldn't do before?
Many things. So if you just deal with the technology aspect in it, for example, we have the ability now to plan and study the body, plan the autopsy and study the body using imaging techniques such as MR, magnetic resonance imaging. So this allows us to see inside and detect injuries or disease processes, which will then be studied by post-mortem examination, which is the full autopsy. We can detect fractures, the nature of those fractures in cases of child abuse. We can process DNA samples looking for genes that might result in sudden cardiac death, that is, inherited disorders that kill young people that may have implications for the genetics of families. There are a number of other remarkable things that we can do. And one of the things that I'm particularly encouraged about is our ability to use our new facilities as a focal point for training young forensic pathologists.
Well, let me pick up on that. When something bad happens and you've got a body in there that you've got to examine and investigate and try to get to the bottom of what happened to that person, the pathologists who investigate these matters, who are they today?
Today, the pathologists that do that work are forensic pathologists. And one of the remarkable things that flowed out of the Goudge inquiry was a major commitment to postgraduate medical education in the area of forensic pathology. So we're cross-appointed at the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine, and we've partnered with the U of T to produce the first residency training program in forensic pathology.
So in other words, these aren't just docs.
These are doctors that have gone through many years of postgraduate training in pathology and ultimately forensic pathology. This is a rigorous process where they get certified by examination at the end of their training.
Did they have to be certified before to do this work?
No, that was one of the deficiencies that Goudge demonstrated in his report, which was forensic pathology was really not a recognized discipline in Canada at the time. There was no domestic training program for forensic pathologists. So this represents a huge development. Now we can train forensic pathologists for Canada that can work in this facility and contribute to the resolution of cases in the criminal justice system.
Can I ask you a bit of an odd question here? You're a doctor, right?
Yes.
Your patients are dead. So what obligation do you have as a doctor to a dead person?
Our obligations are exactly analogous to the doctor-patient relationship that we see in clinical medicine. And it's for two main reasons. The first one is our framework as medical practitioners allows us to identify the ethical importance of conducting ourselves in a manner, respecting the body, finding the truth relative to the cause of death and the issues that flow from that. But also we have to respect that the person who has died is a member of a family. And so as physicians, we have a duty to connect with that family. We do so in various ways in the system, but that is a very strong ethical connection that pathologists as doctors have. I will point out, however, that there's one arguably overriding consideration, and that is that as forensic pathologists, we've sometimes been called the family practitioners to the dead, in that society has an unusual or peculiar interest in our work. In other words, it's a branch of medicine that delivers at the societal level as well. We provide truth through our lens as forensic pathologists for many possible stakeholders. The criminal courts, such as the trier of fact juries, the family, special interest groups, if you're in the international domain, non-governmental organizations. So there are many, many parties that have a specific interest in our work, and on that basis, the forensic pathologist has a unique ethical obligation to all of those groups.
I do want to get inside your head a little bit more, though, because it's got to be the case that 99% of the people who go into medicine do so because they want to help keep people alive. And that's not really your game. Your game is to kind of figure out how they died, and you know, I've got to sort of ask, why the interest in dead people?
Well, I mean, if you can understand why people die, you can use that information to the advantage of the living. And we see that really in two specific ways in our work. The first is in the straightforward manner of criminal justice and public safety, where tangible results that flow from the work of forensic pathologists are of benefit to how single cases enter or leave the criminal justice system. And then you can look at the broader level, you know, for example, public health. Things like SARS or potential natural disasters. Forensic pathologists play a role in contributing to our understanding of emerging pathogens that affect civilian populations. There are so many ways in which a forensic pathologist can harness the knowledge that comes from studying the dead for the benefit of the living. I mean, ultimately, as I said, we work in a medical framework which is trying to help living people.
We talked about the fact that 5 years ago there was a serious credibility problem around investigations in this province. And we've also talked about the fact that you've got a new, bigger, flashier headquarters with lots of state-of-the-art equipment in there. You've got better trained pathologists now. You have new procedures and processes in place. So, of course, the question then becomes, how much more credible are your investigations today than they were 5 years ago before all this happened?
Well, I believe that the team that we've constructed for medical legal death investigation in this province rivals the best in the world at this point.
Now, you say that because everybody says that, but can you really prove that?
Well, I think I can, in fact, because if you look at what constitutes credibility, I think in our line of work that essentially boils down to two factors. The first is expertise. So you must have, in other words, you must be believable. You must inspire the confidence that people believe in your work. And the way you do that is by working in this way that I've described, this evidence-based manner in which you follow the evidentiary clues that are present in the investigation and produce logical conclusions that flow from them. That is fortified by this type of academic connections that we've tried to instill in our work. The second piece of this, and this is a very important part of credibility, is the fact that we are impartial witnesses. We function as expert witnesses in the criminal justice system We may be called by the Crown, we may be called by the defense, but we're there to bear witness to what we've seen. We're there to provide the answers that flow from a medical and scientific analysis of the case.
You don't feel you've got skin in the game, in other words?
We have no skin in the game. In fact, what we do is we balance these two perspectives. We balance the need for impartiality and providing reasonable opinions based upon data. And when you combine both of those things together in the criminal justice system, you get a credible result. You can see this by watching one of our pathologists testify. You can read the judgments from the Ontario Court of Appeal. You can look at these tangible indicators that show that there is this philosophical and scientific commitment to the sorts of modernization of forensic pathology that I'm talking about.
So the chances today of, let's call it what it was, a rogue pathologist getting in there and perverting justice, and people go to jail when they shouldn't go to jail, what are the odds on that happening today?
Well, it would be difficult to quantify something like this, but what I can tell you, for example, is that now what we do is robust peer review. So, for example, if an autopsy is performed on a case that will enter the criminal justice system, one of our forensic pathology colleagues will review that case and provide a second set of eyes to the analysis. And in some circumstances, more than one pathologist might review the case. So, for example, if you have highly controversial or socially relevant cases, such as the deaths of infants and children, for example, in the context of child abuse, or sudden and unexpected death in police custody.
Let's do a real example plucked out of the headlines recently. Sammy Atim, he came to you.
That's correct.
His body ended up in your shop.
That is correct. And what happened in that case was this type of analytical step-by-step process that I've talked about. The application of the scientific principles of forensic pathology embedded within this quality system of peer review. So that does represent a substantive difference from the past and now. And I'll point out, in fact, that this represents really a progressive growth and evolution in medicine in general. The going from highly putting a lot of emphasis on anecdotal evidence to more scientific evidence, and moving from individual expert opinion to collaborative opinions that are peer-reviewed as a general feature of modern medicine.
If you are, I don't mean to be a smart aleck in asking this question, but if you are the best in the world, you plural, at what you do I assume that you get calls from other places around the world saying, we need some of your folks to come down here and lend a hand?
We do, in fact, respond to requests from the international community, particularly in times of natural disaster.
Give it for instance.
Well, for example, after the Indian Ocean tsunami, the earthquake in Haiti, there are certain large events which involve deaths of civilians after internal armed conflict. And in those circumstances, forensic pathologists from jurisdictions that can provide assistance will be asked to lend expertise.
Have you done that?
I have, and many of my colleagues in Ontario have.
Where have you gone?
Well, I've been to the Indian Ocean tsunami, Haiti, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, various countries, Jamaica. And my role, as I've indicated there, and the role of my colleagues when we go abroad, is really to provide that medical and scientific lens to the death investigation. It might be in the context, for example, of identifying bodies after mass disaster. It may be documenting injuries and causes of death for subsequent international criminal prosecutions.
Well, that's what I wanted to follow up on, because if, for example, some generalissimo decides to wipe out some of his population, as sadly happens too often in this world, and you're coming in from the international community to check things out, are you in danger when you go to these places?
Well, we have the benefit of always working in a team. and one of the members of the team are security and military officials. So we're never on our own, as it were. We're always working as part of a larger international effort. But it's a very interesting point, because forensic pathology is one of the smallest and youngest medical specialties in Canada. But it has it's a remarkable distinction of being one of those specialties that has a sort of a broad global impact. And that's one of the remarkable things about this line of work, because you can use essentially simple medical and scientific observations and produce remarkable data that is of value, for example, to courts, human rights tribunals, and other organizations that are interested in looking at human rights and international criminal and humanitarian law. So it's a remarkable thing where you can go from a very small discipline that's focused on something very narrow, like an autopsy, but see how it has such broad application globally.
A couple of minutes left. I want to tackle two more things. We started talking about Charles Smith and his sins, which led to the difficulties that you found 5 years ago. Where is he today?
I don't know where Dr. Smith is today. What I can tell you is that what we've learned from the events surrounding the wrongful convictions and the events that led to the Goudge inquiry have greatly strengthened forensic pathology in this province. And this has really improved our ability to contribute to just outcomes in the criminal justice system.
Do we assume he does not live in Ontario anymore?
I really don't know.
Not sure? Okay. Last question. Do you watch CSI and these kinds of shows?
I don't, but I know jurors do.
Now, of course they would, because they're of the population. But you don't watch this stuff?
No, I don't.
Have you ever watched it?
No, I haven't.
Why not?
Well, I don't find it to be very interesting. What I find in my work is that it's a captivating discipline, forensic pathology. And the privilege that we have of working in this area of really mining data and facts, and what's a very interesting subject matter, is enough for me.
You could probably make big bucks as a consultant on one of these shows, you know.
That might be true. Maybe some of my colleagues do that.
Michael Pollanen, Chief Forensic Pathologist of Ontario. It's good of you to come in at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.